In a world where every emotion is digitized, we search for the rare, flickering pulse of a genuine human heart. Explore the deep connection between man and machine in our latest high-contrast cinematic series. Click subscribe now and witness the beautiful collision of humanity and technology today.
The consultant walked into that conference room like he was about to change the aviation industry forever. 32 years old, fresh MBA from Wharton, a PowerPoint deck with 47 slides, and absolutely zero idea what a designated engineering representative actually does. He set his laptop on the table, clicked to slide 1, and smiled at everyone like he was doing us a favor just by being in the room. I'd been doing this job for 18 years. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest of this story. 18 years of sitting across the table from FAA inspectors who had seen every trick, every shortcut, every creative interpretation of airworthiness standards that a manufacturer had ever tried to slide past them. 18 years of signing my name to certification documents that said, legally and personally, that an aircraft or a system was safe to fly. My signature, my license, my responsibility if something went wrong at 35,000 feet. When my boss called me into his office 2 weeks before the consultant arrived, I thought he wanted to talk about the timeline. We were 8 months into the certification process for a new avionics integration system, the kind of work that normally takes 2 years minimum, but we'd been pushing hard and we were ahead of schedule. The FAA program manager, a man I'd worked with on 3 previous certifications, had told me privately that our documentation package was the cleanest he'd seen in a decade. I was proud of that. My team was proud of that. My boss closed the door and told me the company had brought in an outside firm to optimize the path to certification. The consulting group had done similar work in pharmaceuticals and financial services, he said. They had a proprietary methodology for accelerating regulatory approval timelines by an average of 38%. I asked if they had aviation experience. He said their methodology was industry agnostic. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him to say it again because I wanted to make sure I'd heard it correctly. He said it again. I told him, as calmly as I could, that FAA aircraft certification was not a pharmaceutical trial. It was not a financial services audit. There was no industry-agnostic methodology for getting a designated engineering representative's signature on documents that would determine whether pilots and passengers lived or died. I told him the FAA program manager knew me personally, knew my work, and had built a level of trust with our team that had taken years to establish. That trust was not a variable in a consulting firm's spreadsheet. It was the thing that made the whole process work. My boss told me to keep an open mind. The consultant's name was Kyle. I will call him the consultant because that is what he was and what he remained, no matter how many times he introduced himself as the Director of Regulatory Acceleration. He had a firm handshake and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything important enough to have real consequences. He talked about friction points and legacy processes and stakeholder alignment the way some people talk about religion, with total certainty and no interest in questions. In that first meeting, he pulled up a slide showing our certification timeline and circled 4 phases in red. He called them redundant validation loops. He said that by eliminating them, we could shave 14 weeks off our schedule and submit our final documentation package to the FAA by the 1st of the following month. One of those red circles was around our conformity inspection process. Another was around our failure modes analysis review. I looked at those circles and I felt something cold move through my chest. I explained what conformity inspections were. I explained why they existed. I explained what happens when an aircraft system is certified based on documentation that doesn't accurately reflect the physical hardware. Not as a theoretical possibility, but as something I had seen with my own eyes earlier in my career. On a program where shortcuts like the ones he was proposing had led to a fleet grounding that cost the manufacturer $400 million and 2 years of remediation work. The consultant nodded through all of it. Then he said that historical precedent wasn't necessarily predictive of future outcomes when the right optimization framework was applied. I looked at my boss. My boss looked at his laptop. Over the next 3 weeks, the consultant restructured our certification team. He brought in 4 associates from his firm, all of them sharp, all of them organized, none of them with any background in aviation regulation. He built a new project management system that tracked every task, every deliverable, every hour of work. It was genuinely impressive to look at. It just had no relationship to how FAA certification actually functioned. The system treated regulatory review like a checklist, something you move through linearly, item by item, until you reach the end. Anyone who had ever sat in front of an FAA inspector knew that it wasn't a checklist. It was a relationship. It was a conversation that had been going on for months, building on itself, where every answer you gave shaped what the next question would be. I tried to explain this. I tried multiple times, in multiple formats, in meetings and in writing. I sent my boss a detailed memo outlining the specific risks of removing the conformity inspection phase. I requested a call with the consultant and his team where I walked through the FAA's certification standards line by line and showed them exactly where their timeline assumptions broke down. I was professional. I was thorough. I was not emotional about it, even though I felt like a man watching someone confidently rewire a house with the power still on. 3 weeks and 2 days after the consultant arrived, my boss called me into his office again. This time he had HR there. He said that the company was moving in a new strategic direction and that my role was being eliminated. He thanked me for my years of service. He slid an envelope across the desk. I looked at the envelope. I looked at my boss. I looked at my boss. I looked at the HR manager who was looking at the wall. I picked up the envelope. I stood up. I said, and I want you to understand that I chose these words very carefully because I knew what was coming and I wanted them to be remembered. I said, the aircraft doesn't care about your timeline. I hope the people reviewing your package understand that as well as I do. Then I walked out. I want to tell you that I felt some dramatic emotion in that moment. Anger maybe, or grief, or the satisfying certainty of a man who knows he's right. Mostly what I felt was tired and very, very clear about what was going to happen next. I had 18 years of relationships in this industry. I had my DRR license, which the company did not own and could not take with them. I had 3 former colleagues who called me within 48 hours of the news getting out, 2 of them with job offers. I took the one that was a smaller company, less money, less prestige. But it was a program I believed in, working with people who understood what the work actually was. I gave myself exactly 1 week to be angry. Then I moved on. What I did not do, and I want to be clear about this because it matters, I did not call the FAA program manager. I did not send warnings to anyone on the certification team. I did not try to intervene in the process from the outside. It wasn't my program anymore. It wasn't my call. And honestly, it didn't need me to make anything happen. I just had to wait. I found out later, in pieces, from people who had been there, how it unfolded. The consultants team submitted the documentation package to the FAA 6 weeks after I left. They had hit their timeline. The consultant sent a company-wide email calling it a historic achievement. My boss replied all with a gif of someone doing a victory dance, which I heard about from 3 different people who thought I needed to know. The FAA program manager received the package and began his review. I had worked with this man on 3 certifications. I knew how he read documentation. I knew what he looked for, what questions he asked, what made him lean back in his chair and reach for his coffee and go quiet for a long moment before he said anything. What he found in the package was not what we had built together over 8 months. It was a documentation structure he had never seen before, organized around the consultant's project management system rather than the FAA's own certification framework, with several phases of the standard review process simply absent. He requested a meeting. That meeting, I was told by someone who attended it, lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the FAA program manager handed my replacement, a young engineer from the consultant's team who had been designated as the new point of contact, a letter outlining 37 items requiring resolution before the review could continue. Item 1 was the conformity inspection documentation. Item 2 was the failure modes analysis. Items 3 through 12 were the downstream consequences of not having done items 1 and 2. This is the part that people outside aviation don't always understand. When you skip a step in FAA certification, you don't just have to go back and do the step you skipped. You have to go back and redo everything that was built on top of it because the regulatory record has to show a clean, unbroken chain of evidence. You cannot patch a foundation. You have to pour a new one. The consultants team requested an extension. The FAA granted a standard 30-day response window. The team spent that 30 days trying to reconstruct documentation for processes they had never actually performed. They couldn't reconstruct it, of course, because documentation of a conformity inspection requires physical inspection records, photos, measurements, sign-offs from engineers who were present on the floor when the hardware was examined. You cannot write those records after the fact. The hardware had since been modified 3 times in preparation for the submission timeline. On day 29, someone finally called the FAA program manager and asked him, informally, what it would take to get back on track. He told them that in his professional opinion, based on the documentation as submitted, the program needed to restart the certification process from the conformity inspection phase. He estimated the minimum timeline at 14 months. The company had promised their launch customer delivery in 9. The launch customer, a regional carrier that had already taken delivery of ground support equipment and begun pilot training, had a contract with a liquidated damages clause. For every month of delay beyond the agreed delivery date, the manufacturer owed a penalty. I am not going to tell you the exact number because the exact number was not something I was ever officially told. What I will tell you is that 3 people described it to me independently at different times, and all 3 of them used the phrase catastrophic. My boss, I heard, did not take it well. He had signed off on the consultant's timeline. He had presented it to the board as a model for how the company would manage future certification programs. He had, I was told, put the consultant's firm's name in a press release that had been drafted but not yet sent, announcing the successful accelerated certification as a case study in regulatory efficiency. That press release was never sent. The consultant, I was told, continued to argue for several weeks that the FAA program manager's interpretation was overly conservative and that a different approach to the remediation could work. He prepared a presentation on alternative pathways to certification that he wanted to bring to the FAA directly over the program manager's head. His associates built the deck. It had very good graphics. I don't know if that meeting ever happened. I was no longer paying close attention by then. What I do know is that 8 weeks after the FAA's letter, 10 weeks after I had walked out of my boss's office with an envelope, I got a phone call from a number I recognized. It was the VP of engineering. Not my direct boss, his boss. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I told him I did. He did not apologize immediately. He asked about my new position first, how things were going, whether I had settled in. He asked about my family. I appreciated that, actually. It would have felt worse if he had skipped straight to the ask. After about 10 minutes of that, he told me the program was in a difficult situation. He said they were looking at their options and that my name had come up in the context of the remediation effort. He asked if I would consider coming back. I asked him what he was thinking. He said they would need me to essentially restart the certification review from the conformity inspection phase. He said they understood it was a significant ask. He mentioned a number. It was a significant number. I told them I needed a few days to think about it. I talked to my wife that night. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she said, "Do you want to do it?" I told her I wasn't sure. Part of me didn't want to walk back into that building. Part of me felt like it would mean something that I didn't want it to mean, like I was validating everything that had happened by going back to clean it up. She said, "Or it means you're good at your job and you know it." I called the VP of engineering back on Thursday. We agreed on terms. I went back the following Monday. The consultant and his team were gone by then. My boss was still there, though he seemed to have lost about 10 pounds and developed a new habit of staring at his desk when we were in the same room. I didn't make it hard for him. I wasn't there to make anything hard. I was there because a certification program needed to be done right, because there were pilots and passengers at the end of this process who would never know my name and would never know any of this story, and they deserved for it to be done right. The FAA program manager and I had coffee the first week I was back. He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't have to. We talked about the program, what needed to happen, what the realistic timeline looked like. He said it was good to be working together again. I told him I felt the same way. The remediation took 16 months. We delivered 14 months late, which triggered the liquidated damages clause and cost the company a number I still don't know precisely but have always assumed was large. We delivered a certification package that was, if anything, cleaner and more thorough than the original would have been, because the program manager and I had used the restart as an opportunity to address some documentation practices that had been sloppy even before the consultant arrived. On the day we got final approval, the program manager shook my hand in the parking lot outside the FAA regional office. He said, "Nice work." That was it. That was enough. I stayed with the company for 2 more years after that, then moved on to a position I liked better. My boss eventually left for a smaller firm in the Pacific Northwest. I heard from a mutual contact that he went into consulting himself, which I thought was funny in a way that it stopped being funny by the time I thought about it for more than 30 seconds. The consultant, Kyle. I lost track of him. His firm's website was still up for a while, still advertising their regulatory acceleration methodology. Whether it was still operating, I couldn't tell you. Aviation has a long memory, and word gets around in a community this small, and I suspect that a case study involving 14 months of remediation and a catastrophic damages payout was not exactly the advertisement they were looking for. I think about that conference room sometimes, the way he clicked through those slides, the way he circled those 4 phases in red and called them redundant. He wasn't a bad person. I've thought about that a lot over the years, and I genuinely don't believe he was malicious. He was just someone who had been very successful at something, at organizing information, at presenting confidence, at building systems that looked comprehensive, and had made the reasonable but catastrophic mistake of assuming that success transferred, that because he understood the shape of regulatory process, he understood regulatory process. The shape of a thing and the thing itself are not the same. You learn that in aviation. You learn it in the hardest possible ways, and the whole structure of certification exists precisely because of every time someone before us had to learn it the hardest possible way. My nephew is finishing his engineering degree this spring. He came to visit last month and we were talking about where he wanted to go, what kind of work he was interested in, and he said something about wanting to move fast, about not wanting to be slowed down by old ways of doing things. He's 22. He's supposed to think that way. I told him that speed was good. I told him I had spent my career trying to find every legitimate way to move faster, to streamline, to make processes more efficient, and that I believed in all of it. Then I told him there was a difference between streamlining a process and skipping it, a difference between moving fast and moving blind, and that the difference wasn't always visible from the outside. It mostly looked the same right up until it didn't. He asked me how you know which one you're doing. I told him, you know the work deeply enough to know what the process is for, not just what it requires, but why it requires it, what it's protecting, who it's protecting. When you know that, when you sat with it long enough that it's not a rule anymore but an understanding, then you can start asking what can genuinely be changed. But not before, never before. He thought about that for a while. Then he asked if I had another story. I told him I had a few.